Well, I'm really excited to be here and to get to see students again. I miss my students a lot. So if you were my students, I would be missing you because I'd be gone and you'd be off doing something really exciting. You can laugh at that because it's not. My husband tells me I'm terrible at jokes. Okay, Esther didn't ask for anything small tonight. She asked me to summarize this and to summarize this. And these are thick books, and there's a lot going on with them. And you're welcome to take a look at them. How many of you have read this book? I think the development people and some of the others. This is the new one. Have you all read the second edition? Those of you that have read it, have you read the second edition? Don't read the first edition. It's out of date. Read the second edition. Now, what Esther asked me to do was to pretty much summarize this huge body of research that we've worked on. And that's what I'm going to work at doing. So the book that I want to, this was the first book, the first edition here. And I didn't work on this, the first edition, but I did work on the second edition, and we've totally redone it. So it's very different, but it accomplishes the same goals. After we finished after Sex and World Peace was started, we were working on various projects, and okay, let's see if we can get this up. Okay, and there's a team of us that worked on this. Valerie Hudson, who was my colleague in political science and is now the Bush Chair down at Texas A&M, and she's very good at recruiting people to go down there and do graduate work, especially the BYU students. And the other person that worked on the team is Lynn Nielsen, who was a professor of stats. And some of you that are older may have taken Stats 121 with her. And does that ring any bells? She's just retired as well. But the three of us put together an enormous amount of work, an absolutely stunning amount of work. And the subject that we were interested in was marriage, just like all of you. We were interested in marriage. And I like to read advice columns in the newspapers, and they talk about bad marriage most of the time. They'll refer to good marriages here and there. And I have friends, and I hear about their problems. We get to hear about all kinds of marital problems. And what I had realized when I was teaching the class that gave rise to the Sex and World Peace book is that there was an awful lot that went on in marriage that was quite political. And we worked it out for this book as to what's going on. And the title for the book, The First Political Order, is a play on Francis Fukuyama, who had written a book on the political order of nations. And in it, he hardly mentioned women at all. And so we took revenge by writing our book and coming up with a lot about women. And I need to warn you that this is tough stuff, and there's a lot going on. And to quote Professor Isam Verhaeren just tonight, she said, "It is so depressing. This is all so depressing," and it is. This is hard stuff, because what you're going to learn when you're spending time in the Middle East and when you're reading for your classes, this is tough stuff, and it's getting tougher. It's getting tougher. So as you look at a family, the question that really needs to be taken up is, how do you take two people, a male and a female, joined together in order to marry and to have children, okay? How do they interrelate to each other? Will they stand next to each other as equals? Will you have one superior or one inferior? Very often in the advice columns, the problems are because one's got an edge on the other and is simply behaving in a rather jerky way for whatever the problem is that they bring up. And the solution to general jerkiness in relationships is strong communication. But in order to be able to communicate, you need to be able to regard each other as equals. You may be very different people, but do you both count equally in the relationship? Who makes decisions within the group? Is it always one, or is it always the other? How do you deal with conflicts? Is abuse involved? Do you simply pound someone into submission? Or do you present your arguments and make sense? And then how do you deal with the resource issue? I had a friend down the street who would go out and buy groceries, and then she'd come home with the receipt from the grocery store and go over it item by item by item with her husband. He needed to know how every penny was spent. Can you guess how much longer that marriage lasted? Not very long. Not very long at all. So how do you deal with resources? Who has a voice in it? Do you take resources away from one and spend it on whatever you want? Or are they used equally for all the members of the family? Well, these are all political questions. And the answers to these questions establishes the first political order within a society, which is the family. But they also give us clues to other larger groups within the society. Now, where do we look to see the order? How many of you were thinking as I went through the characteristics of a relationship in a family? How many of you were thinking male, female, female, male, male, female? All right. Who won? Who did the best? The men or the women? Well, if we look worldwide, men do much, much better. They do much better. So, if we want to say, how are we going to equal things out? How do we equalize these orders? What do we look at? Do we look at getting women an education? Do we look at getting them jobs? Do we look at putting them into positions of power, such as parliament, or in commerce, in businesses? And these three factors are the ones that are most often measured by the international groups, the nonprofits, and the really excellent groups that do research on women's power. And what we've learned in our research is those three count a lot in various ways. But the first political order is actually about the level of the household. And we have to look at very, very different measures. Okay? So if women are disempowered, here are some of the characteristics. Is the woman able to consent to her own marriage? Or is she pushed into it by family members or by her potential suitor? How old is she when she gets married? Is she a legal age of 18 or is she less than that? What say does the woman have within her marriage? Can she make suggestions and have them accepted equally? What types of property does the woman possess? Is she given equal inheritance rights to men? Family law governs every society when it comes to what goes on within the family. Are there inequities in the family law, such as can only men sue for divorce? Who would get child custody? Would they be men? Is marriage patrilocal? Do any of you know what patrilocal means? Patrilocal means that when a couple gets married, the wife goes to live with the husband's family. And this is very, very common in tribal societies. It's very, very common in much of the Middle East. We're beginning to see some changes right now that I'd like to talk about. But now, just imagine for a moment, women, imagine that you're being married off and you're 17, maybe 18, maybe you're legal, and your husband comes to get you and you move to his family. What would that be like? Who's the boss of your life? Well, your husband in some ways, but the biggest boss of your life is actually your mother-in-law. And some of us are lucky and have wonderful mothers-in-law, and others of us don't do quite as well. Do you see your family? Not very often, because they live a ways away, and you need your husband's permission to go and visit and be with them. So essentially, you've been cut off from your natal family and sent to live with another different family. And this fact of patrilocality governs so much that happens in a woman's life. One of the biggest questions is, who is reimbursed for the fact that your parents have raised you? Do you pay your spouse, the person you marry? Is he given what's called a dowry? Or is he given, or is your father paid a sum by the bridegroom's family to compensate them for having raised you, and supposedly to give you some insurance in case there's divorce? Okay. Is polygyny prevalent? Is cousin marriage prevalent? How does the society view domestic violence? Is it considered an ordinary way to treat a woman, that a woman deserves to be beaten? And is murder of a woman, femicide, is that considered normal? So how much abuse is prevalent? And then finally, are women property? And is rape considered a property crime, whereby if you were to be raped, the way the perpetrator, if he were apprehended, would get out of it would be to propose to you and have you marry him? Can you imagine marrying your rapist and being sent to his family to be raised? Well, all of these different factors operate in what we call a vicious circle. And this is a Greek symbol. It's an Ouroboros, which is a snake eating its tail. And they go around and around and around. And it's hard to find the beginning, and it's hard to find the end. Now, we call all of these characteristics of essentially a subordinate family relationship for women to be a syndrome, a patriarchal, fraternal syndrome. And the syndrome's job is to see that the societal organization, which is prime in the society, operates well. And the group that is most important is an extended male kin network. And we call these clans or tribes, and we could spend hours studying clans and tribes. Clans and tribes are enormously important because throughout history, if we were to take our family history all the way back to the very beginning, we would find that we were all parts of clans and tribes. Now living in the United States, we don't see very much of this, but you see it in so many different parts of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, Soviet Union, China, former Eastern Bloc. And the job of these kin networks is to provide security for the group from anyone else who's outside. And these groups are enormously important. They're just enormously important. Because where are you without security? Where are you if someone who comes after you can take you? What if the University of Utah decides to make war on BYU? How would you unite? You would unite as, essentially, BYU becoming one giant kin network. And who would we rely on to take out the University of Utah? The men primarily. Why? Why men? Why are men important here? Come on, some of you know this. They're stronger. They're stronger. They have far superior upper body strength, which is why we see a division and we see the importance of the male kin. But this also turns into a trap for the entire society, in that the most victorious male kin networks, the tribes that are the strongest, the clans who are the most successful, will generally take important parts of the government and will work to lead the land mass that they are living in. Now, does this bring happiness and democracy and peace? No, generally it brings instability, terror, violence, coercion, autocracy, and most of all, corruption, enormous amounts of corruption. Because it's essentially the family unit made large with males in charge. And what we see, we discovered as we did our research, is that the society bears the cost of governance by a superior kin group. And the problems that arise are the problems of bad government everywhere. So, what you do to your woman, you do to your society. You subject your woman to bad behavior, you're doing that to your society. So, where do we find some of these syndrome practices? What we did in this project was to determine what the syndrome was, and then we did empirical analyses and we mapped them. So this map gives you a sense of where the syndrome is most in place. Societies that are ruled by tribes and that see quite a bit of bad governance and then all the problems that emanate from bad governance. How does the Middle East do?
Not very well.
The Middle East doesn't do well at all, and I got in a huge amount of trouble presenting this material in Jordan once. But that's a story for another day. Were any of you there? Some of the BYU students were there. They were laughing their heads off at my discomfort. Okay. But if you look, what you see essentially are variations in the syndrome is present and hardly mitigated, or the syndrome totally dominates the society. Now, this makes sense because we know that Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa, Middle East, South Asia, these are tribal areas. And we determined this as we did our research gathering and our analysis. But look at China. Okay? Look at parts of Latin America and Mexico. We found in most of Latin America that it was an area in transition. The syndrome was present but had been mitigated. If we'd done the study probably 30 years earlier, we would have seen a much greater prevalence of tribalism and the syndrome in Latin America. The Soviet Union is actually in many ways much worse than it looks on this map. Okay? So you have Western Europe, Australia, and North America that come out fairly well. And then we see countries like Mongolia, Eastern Europe, Argentina, Chile, that are doing better, that are doing much, much better. Okay, now what I want to take you through, I think we have time, is examples of how the syndrome translates into problems in governance. Okay? Sometimes we see the links between the syndrome and between massive social problems very, very quickly. And one example for this is bride price. Now, in Islam, bride price is a very important part of marriage law. And it is designed, in fact, to give the women, to give the bride recourse if the marriage doesn't turn out well. In other words, it's a sum of money or property that's put in the hands of her guardians. And if something happens in the marriage, if there is a divorce, then she is to be given this bride price. And the terms, have you had enough Arabic to know the terms? I'll just leave it there, okay? What happens in reality in so many parts of the Middle East is that the bride price is paid to the father, the guardian, the brother, and he takes the money and uses it for whatever he needs it for. And the woman will never see the money, ever again, okay? Now, imagine if you're a young man. You need to come up with a considerable sum of money, sometimes about $1,500 for the poorer families, perhaps $10,000, perhaps $40,000, $50,000, a couple of $100,000 for the wealthier families. And these essentially are like a flat tax on young men. It's very, very difficult. Could any of you come up with that kind of money to get married? Does it throw horror in your hearts to think about it? It should. The other form of payment at marriage is dowry, and men love dowries because the woman's family pays the man's family for taking her. And there are reasons for all of this, why one or why not the other. In the case of dowry cultures, the women do not fare well either, which you probably could have predicted. And in India, for example, which is a prime example of a dowry culture, some of the more horrible family situations will murder the young woman so that the son can marry again and be given a second dowry. Okay? So it's often staged as an accident, and but it's horrible. Dowry is illegal, but it hasn't done anything to getting rid of the practice. Okay. Now, the price of marriage, the price of bride price, has gone up and up and up and up over time. And bride price is also linked to polygyny, which is something that prevails among the very wealthy, because they're the only ones that can pay consistent bride prices over time for more and more women. Okay. Now, what these practices end up doing is essentially constricting the marriage market. Instead of the marriage market being wide and open with people who fall in love with each other and who want to get married, being able to make lives together, we see fewer and fewer people being able to marry. And those that are working at saving the money end up pushing off marriage for 10 years, 15 years, sometimes 20 years. And older men dominate the marriage market and pick off all the desirable young women. This is not popular among young men. And ISIS is one example of a group that essentially provided bride prices for the men it was trying to recruit. And young men would come out of, say, Cairo, Damascus, and join up. And they would be promised brides. And ISIS would pay the bride price, and they would be able to marry. Boko Haram in northern Nigeria is famous for essentially capturing a large group of young female students, Christians, young Christians. And they captured about 80 young women and put them aside in a captivity and said, "You will marry me." And if the woman said no, they were beaten. And if they said yes, then they were married. Some of the women were abducted, and in one case, one young man left a token bride price, like $100, on the ground as the group left. Okay. We're seeing this. I hate to think what's happening in the Sudan right now with the civil war. We definitely know that there's a long, long history of bride price being used for ill and being used to fund and to support violence in the societies. We're seeing it right now often in the Syrian refugee camps, where the parents have fled Aleppo or the areas that are in danger in Syria. They're living in refugee camps. They have no income whatsoever. They have teenage girls, maybe 12, 13, 14. And they're very, very worried about what will happen to these women. When they leave the tent at night to go out and use a lavatory facility, are they safe? Could they be assaulted? If they're assaulted, what does that do to their honor? Could they ever be married? And in the meantime, the families are in financial arrears. They're desperate for money to buy food, to send the younger kids to school, to do whatever needs to be done. And so they contract marriages for their young, very, very often not of age daughters, take the bride price and use it to support the families. It's truly, truly tragic. Okay, I'm going to skip sex. Okay, so what I want to show you now is, do the high syndrome scores associated with bad outcomes for nation states, how do they perform? How do they do? And in analyzing whether or not the impact of the syndrome was good or bad, we measured political stability and governance, we measured security, we measured economics, rentierism, health and well-being, demographic security, education, social progress, which was one of my favorites, and environmental protection. Here are our outcome variables after we combined the ones that were duplicative. Okay, 161 of them. This took us a really long time. This was hard. And we were just incredibly lucky that there was good data available. So what are our findings? Does the syndrome predict problems? Does it predict bad governance? Does it predict possibilities of war and instability? Does it predict a lack of education, bad health, environmental problems? Just take a look, and that gives you a sense of how all of this hits up. Okay. I am not a statistician, and in fact, Josh and I talk about this often. And he would he said, "Why didn't you teach us more statistics?" And I said, "Because I never learned any statistics." Now I know a little bit of statistics, and I would look at our outcomes and I'd say, "Oh my word, this is incredible. This is so good." But across the board, the syndrome was significant at essentially a 74% level, which totally outclassed everything else. We're just so pleased. We are so pleased. Now, what does this mean in reality? If your nation has the syndrome highly encoded, so if you're towards the higher end of the syndrome, every time you go up, and the syndrome runs from number 1 to number 16, with essentially South Sudan being number 16, Yemen being 16 or 15. So if your nation highly encodes the syndrome, every time you go from 8 to 9, or 9 to 10, or 10 to 11, you are upping the odds of becoming a fragile state, a government that is more autocratic, less effective, more corrupt, more stable and violent, having a lower GDP, having a higher fertility rate, experiencing terrorism. So every time you see the syndrome in any of these countries, you know that you have really upped your odds of bad problems. Now, why does this happen? Well, let's go back to the family for a moment. If we disempower, if we subordinate women in the household, we are contributing to instability, insecurity, and conflict in 3 ways. Number 1, the home is a training camp for every child. Okay? There is no better place to learn than to live domestic terror, to see a woman abused, to live in the middle of corruption and exploitation, to live under a father who refuses to listen to any other voices in the family. So homes are where we learn. That's where we pick up everything. In addition, the syndrome operates on all of the activities and the practices that are found in the home: bride price, polygyny, sex ratio alteration, female fetus abortion, for example. And then finally, we're disempowering women, the ones whose voices could be important in restoring some kind of peaceful approach and who could moderate the practice of political violence. Okay. Rose McDermott said, as we were doing all of our research, she said, "Look, the findings are clear, consistent, statistically robust across the board, essentially the kind of thing that social scientists strive for but never find. If these findings were about anything other than women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace. I leave it to readers to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention." And Esther, why don't we just stop here and we can take questions. So anything that wasn't clear or that's given you something to think about, go for it.
if you come up here so those on Zoom can hear you. Dr. Bowen, I let you know, but I wanted to read off these questions from those who submitted them online. There were a couple that came through, and so I'm just going to combine them.
Just go ahead one by one.
One by one?
Be fast.
Okay. Have you seen a connection between the mistreatment of women and the mistreatment of children? What role have children played in your studies, and do the same connections hold true?
When you talk about women, okay, when you talk about the mistreatment of women or anything in society that impacts women's life for ill, you are talking about practices that will decimate a child, that will harm children far in ways that you can't even imagine. But I need to make another point as well, which is it's not just women and children, but it's the men as well. The syndrome is a devastatingly negative impact on men. Now, when you do your reading about politics within the Middle East and you say, how can people act this way? How can they do some of the things they're doing? How can they refuse to step back and work for peace? How can they be responsible for the violence that they're responsible for? These are men that have seen these practices embodied in their lives, especially when they were children. I personally have been worried since I go way back, really the 1970s, the 1980s, about the young Palestinian men. I just have not known how they can live normal lives and how we can have peace in this area. This is essentially your work, Josh. But there was so much vested on them. And think about boys in Vietnam, think about in Cambodia, just think whatever part of the world you want to that has experienced such terrible, terrible things, and ask how they pick up and go forward. So it's not just, when we talk about women are perpetuating a number of these practices. If you read all the materials, you'll say, wait a minute, women are involved in this as well. Women are the ones they're the ones that are setting up the polygynous marriages. They're the ones that are being complicit in taking the bride price for their son to have a bride price to use himself. The women are not angels, and the men are not devils. This is why we say the syndrome is a trap. It catches people, and it does not let them go. It's hard to step out. It's very hard to step out. And I'm very worried because I'm seeing the beginnings of practices in this country that I think will erode the democratic norms and are essentially accustoming us to more autocracy. And as I look at it, I see the position of women being harmed step by step. I've got a fair amount more to say about things like that. But
okay, the second question was, what are the most practical ways to reach the rural, illiterate Muslim woman and inform her of her inalienable and universal human rights?
Okay, if we look at young women that in countries, not Jordan, which is doing a magnificent job of educating all their women and men, great job. But if we look at countries like Egypt and Morocco, which have had a terrible time raising the levels of education over the last 40 years, what we see is young women being denied an education and at the same time being married off at a very young age. Now, Morocco has been really good about enacting laws of ages for marriage, and they've upped the marriage age to 18 for women. The question is, can it really be practiced? What's going on? Are people sneaking? And when I did my research there was a fair amount of sneaking. And what we need to see is that the laws account for petitions. So the parents, the relatives can make a petition, and then the judges will say, oh, all right, we'll let the girl get married at 15. That just isn't working. It's not going to work. They need to stick to the 18-year-old level, because then the women are old enough to have a little better sense of who they are and to have a sense of what they need. There's a great example in the New Sex and World Peace book about female circumcision in the Maasai community in Kenya. And they just said, if we can keep the women from being cut, from being circumcised, then they can stay in school, and then they can't be married off. So that's it. That's what you have to do.
Okay.
And there's often a bunch of things that all goes together.
Okay, and then the third question was, how does your research account for queerness and queer theory's possibilities beyond a gender binary? How does queerness affect world peace?
And we wish we had answers to that. When we worked on this book, about 15 years had gone by since the first edition, and a lot of things in the world had changed, including the definition of gender. The definition of gender is a very different definition than it was then. And we simply decided that we didn't have any data, and we could not talk about queer theory. And we definitely had no data on the practice of young queer adults or teenagers. And so as a result, we determined that we had to just stick with women. We had to stay with women and look at what's going on with women. And you'll see when you read this book, it's about women. It's not about men. It's about women, but the same cautions apply that I just gave you. Women are not always the best at doing what's good for other women. So in the next decade or two, some of you will be looking for data, and perhaps you'll be writing these books, and that'll be terrific. Any other questions? We have some moments before the food is put out. In the meantime, while you think of questions, I need to tell you that this last week we have seen we've seen a couple of examples of what really impacts change in the Middle East. And it's been the earthquake in Morocco and the floods in Libya. And when one has a great catastrophe, whether it's a war, an invasion, the COVID pandemic, a global pandemic, had a huge, huge, huge impact. But climate change, climate problems are changing things right and left. Any of these catastrophes, or what we call shocks, they take the system and they transform it. And we begin to see real changes. And I'm seeing it in the United States. I don't know that it's statistically viable or not, but I'm seeing things happen in the United States that are making me wonder a little bit about whether we're responding to the shocks and what kind of negative impact it's going to have for us. So now that I've said that, that gives you something else to factor in. James?
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Bowen, for your presentation and for all of your work. My question, I keep trying to think of holes in this question. I'm sure there are, but I still wanted to raise it. In your research, do you have a way of accounting for places like the United States or France that democratized before increasing rights and opportunities for women?
That was like our very favorite question, and we started with it very, very early, and we found we were referred to an early political theorist, 18th century, Sir Henry Maine, who essentially divided societies into what he called status societies and contract societies. And the status societies were societies that were very traditional. They were group-oriented. Decisions for individuals were made depending on the position of the family in many ways, and the family ruled the individual. Contract societies are what you learn about in your political theory class, right? Where we begin looking at social contracts that are made between governments and individuals, where the individual begins to matter. Now, if you think back the way I was describing families and the tribes and the clans and all of these group practices, the women have no status, essentially. They're not seen as individuals. They're seen as a way to provide the birth of children and perpetuate the group, and in particular to provide the group the birth of a son. So sons are the most important. Females are important because they give birth to sons and they raise them. But they have no standing on their own, absolutely no standing on their own. But what Sir Henry talked about was essentially the United States, Denmark. And it goes back to that great phrase, how do you turn Afghanistan into Denmark? Okay, what do you do? How do you turn a tribal society into a European democracy? And the answer is it's going to take a long time, but here are the things that we look at. And we found the syndrome gives us a way to break this down. And then we begin to see good things happen.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. They want the mic so that the Zoom people can hear you.
I might be able to bring it to you. Okay.
Oh, I put up this map. I included it with my materials. We talk about physical security of women. The dark green is countries where women are physically secure. Okay? Do you see any dark green on that map? There is none. There's not a country. When Christine said this is depressing, this is why. Okay? And this is one thing that COVID has done to us. It's made especially the democratic countries much less physically secure for women. It's a tough thing. But just notice that there are no countries where women can be physically secure. And please pay attention to the United States. We are not doing well at all. Okay.
My question is kind of along the lines of what you were just discussing, but how can we expect these places that are inherently tribal to act like Denmark without trying to force westernized ideas and ideology onto the other half of the world that it isn't even a part of their culture, but they need to rise out of this place. We need to figure out a way to
You want
help
things
them.
to be better, and
Yeah.
yet you don't want to give them a template.
Right, because they're not
You're going to be just
Western.
like Utah.
Mhm.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge question. And what I would suggest doing, first of all, is reading a lot about what they write and what they say, and talk to as many people as you can and find out what's important for them. But I want to turn to a woman who did wonderful work on Afghanistan, and she came at it from a security perspective. Her name is Sarah Chavez, and I may remember the name of her book, or you too may remember. But she wrote an absolutely stunning book on corruption. And corruption in Afghanistan was one of the problems that the United States could not solve. And if you read about the situation in Afghanistan by any of the observers, any of the really good analysts, they will say the biggest problem that the governments faced was they could not cure corruption, mostly because they were making so much money out of it. And we have practically a whole chapter in the book about how the tribal groups essentially perpetuate their own earnings, that they're extremely corrupt. We have great examples, lots of really wonderful examples about this, but her examples from Afghanistan are stunning, absolutely stunning. And it harmed the Afghanis. They knew it was harming them. They wanted to get rid of it. They were tired of paying bribes every time they went on a highway or went from one place to another or needed to get some paperwork done at the major offices. They were furious. They were so upset. And the United States, in their regard, diminished day by day by day because we were not there to solve these problems. Now, how many of you are bothered by corruption? Yeah. So there are so many things that we have in common, that we care about, that they care about. Not always easy to deal with. You know, we're working on it with President Zelensky in the Ukraine right now. Ukraine was an extremely corrupt country, and he's trying to fight a war with Russia and to cut corruption levels in his defense ministry. Okay? There are so many areas where we can work together, but please never assume anything. Afghanistan to Denmark, oh no, you're talking, how long do we think? We could start a lottery, and in 80 years we could see who wins. You know?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I grew up in the Philippines, and I've seen practical.
Did you know that Lynn Nielsen is Filipino?
No.
She was born in the Philippines.
I'd love to meet her.
She's wonderful. You'd love her.
So I've seen practical implications, firsthand and secondhand experiences about like the insecurity, the harms that women face. My question is, where do we actually start in solving the problem? Because in my own perspective, I see that education, like we can start with education, but at the same time, the opportunities to get an education, if you're not economically, like if you can't afford an education, then it's nearly impossible. It's kind of like a catch-22 thing. So my question is, like, where do we start to actually solve the problem?
I don't think you can disregard any of the areas that we listed as being very important. Actually, I can show you. Let's just go back. Okay. Personally, I think one of the biggest places to start is with family law. You've got to give women the right to divorce. You've got to give women the right to consent to their own marriages. You've got to give women a shot at child custody. Those are the big ones. Those are the big ones. Okay. But our data showed us a couple of things. They showed that there were a couple of areas where you really begin to see changes in countries across the board. So we have some statistical evidence for this. And the first is urbanization. Urbanization is happening everywhere in the world. It's going to go on happening. It's almost a natural process. But urbanization was the second most important variable after syndrome. It was a very important predictor. So just the process of urbanization, it tends to separate families from the land. It separates families from each other. It means that when you get married, you'll probably be living in an apartment with your husband instead of with your husband's entire family. Okay, so urbanization is very important. The other is pensions. Countries that pay pensions to their retired folk, thus meaning that the parents do not have to depend upon their son or increasingly their daughter to support them in old age. This tends to change a number of family practices. You don't need to have as many children, so fertility rates are going to decline. Japan is seeing the women stepping up to care for their children more than the husbands. What's happening in Philippines?
I think women are still expected to care for the children and not have a job at all.
So they're not working.
They're
So
not
that
working.
means they can't provide for their parents. So the whole weight goes on the sons in the family.
Sometimes there are also like certain regions in the Philippines
Uh-huh.
where it's just impossible to live off of one income alone, and so like they would, but it's just very complicated because the family dynamics where they're still expected to support their parents even if you already have a family. So
Yeah.
that's added cost to what
Yeah.
you already have as your family.
Yeah, and you know, hearing it from you gives me another wake-up call about how difficult this is. In Morocco, where I did a lot of work, only a certain percentage of middle-class individuals were essentially eligible for pensions. They worked for the government, and they would be eligible for a pension. But private enterprise, they can pay pensions. It really begins to make changes in how women fit in the entire situation.
Also, may I also add to that that I think the conditions in the Philippines, a lot of, because they're not secure, women aren't secure, a lot of them are survivors of sexual assaults, and like sometimes there's children that would come from it, and they, like, women would single-handedly raise them. So that also adds to the problem.
Philippines comes up with amazing women. Esther Jimenez, one example, Lynn Nielsen, you. But I don't know if you even know this, but back about 10, 15 years ago, the Philippines put together one of the most liberal charters for women's rights in the entire world, the Magna Carta of women.
Yes.
You know what happened to that?
Not in detail.
It was essentially shelved under the last president, and it didn't surface again under President Duterte.
Yes.
So we'll see what's going to happen with the change of regime.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, your president is an example like our former president, President Trump, President Duterte, in that they were more autocratic and that the situation for women declined.
Well, we don't even know. I think we're even in the worst condition now that we have literally a son of a dictator presiding our country right now. So we don't know what will happen.
Well, we wish you luck.
Marcos, yes.
We wish you
Thank
luck.
you.
Thank you.